The employee handbook at Whispering Pines has dozens of strange rules, but Rule 4 is the only one written in red. It forbids night staff from looking under the door of room 7. I broke that rule, and something on the other side noticed. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened to me. I am not someone who scares easily. I grew up in a house where the furnace sounded like a man trying to breathe through a broken jaw. I worked a graveyard shift at a packaging warehouse for 2 years, alone, surrounded by machinery that groaned and shuddered like it was alive. I have never been the kind of person who jumps at shadows or reads meaning into strange sounds. I am telling you this not to impress you, but because I need you to understand that when I say what I saw beneath the door of room 7 changed me permanently, I mean it in the most clinical, irreversible sense of those words. I am not the same person who drove into that gravel parking lot on a cold October evening. That version of me no longer exists. The job listing had been on a regional employment board for 11 days when I found it. Night shift manager, Whispering Pines, competitive hourly rate, solo overnight position, experience preferred but not required. The pay was nearly double what I had been making, and after my last job dissolved along with the company that ran it, I was in no position to be selective. I called the number listed. A man named Doyle answered. His voice was flat and unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has already made peace with things most people haven't yet imagined. He asked me 3 questions. Could I work alone? Could I follow instructions precisely? And had I ever worked in hospitality before? I answered yes, yes, and no. He told me the job was mine if I wanted it, and to arrive by 9 o'clock on a Thursday. I didn't look the place up. I should have, but I didn't. The drive out took 40 minutes from the edge of town, and for the last 15 of those minutes, there was nothing alongside the road except pine trees so dense and tall they pressed against the shoulders of the asphalt like a crowd of dark figures leaning in to watch. There were no other buildings, no gas stations, no side roads branching off towards signs of life. Just the 2-lane highway and the trees and the headlights of my car cutting a thin yellow corridor through all that black. When the motel finally appeared, it did so without warning. A low, long structure set back from the road behind a gravel lot, its sign lit in a pale amber that cast more shadow than light. Whispering Pines. The letters had that particular quality of old neon signage where certain segments of certain letters had dimmed, so that the name seemed to shift slightly depending on where you looked. The building itself was a single-story structure arranged in a shallow U shape, with 12 rooms lining the interior of the U and the manager's office positioned at the open end like a watchful eye. The exterior walls were the color of old cream, stained at the base with decades of dampness and road spray. Each room had a door painted a deep burgundy that had faded unevenly, and a single small window beside it, covered from the inside with heavy curtains that allowed no light to escape. The parking lot had a half-dozen cars scattered across it in a pattern that suggested long-term occupancy rather than overnight travelers passing through. These were not the vehicles of people on their way somewhere. These were the vehicles of people who had arrived and stopped moving. Doyle was waiting for me in the office. He was older than his voice had suggested, somewhere in his late 60s, with a face that seemed to be assembled from a collection of sharp angles and deep lines, and eyes that were pale enough to be unsettling in the fluorescent office light. He shook my hand once firmly, and then immediately turned to the desk behind him and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper which he set in front of me without ceremony. "The rules," he said. "Read them tonight. Learn them before morning." The sheet was a numbered list of 12 items, handwritten in black ink with the exception of one. Most of them were what you might expect from any late-night hospitality position. Rule 1 said to keep the exterior lights on at all times and to replace any bulb that died before calling for maintenance. Rule 2 said not to enter any occupied room regardless of the nature of the sounds coming from inside unless there was visible smoke or the guest had triggered the emergency pull cord. Rule 3 was about the log. Every unusual occurrence had to be written down in the red binder kept under the desk, dated and time-stamped, no matter how minor. Rule 5 said the ice machine at the north end of the building should be unplugged between the hours of 1 and 4 in the morning. Rule 6 said the television in the lobby to remain off after midnight, and so on. But Rule 4 was written in red ink. The letters were slightly larger than the rest, pressed harder into the page as if the person writing it had wanted to be absolutely certain the ink went deep. It read, "Do not look under the door of room 7. Do not kneel, crouch, or bend near the threshold. Do not slide anything beneath it. Do not speak directly to the door. If a guest inquires about room 7, inform them it is permanently out of service and redirect them immediately." I read it twice, then I looked up at Doyle. "What's in room 7? I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Nothing you need to know about." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and moved toward the door. "The rules exist because the people before you figured out what happened when they weren't followed. You don't need to understand them. You need to follow them. There's a difference." He left without saying goodnight. I stood in the office for a long moment after the sound of his car faded down the highway. The room smelled of old coffee and something beneath it, something mineral and faintly damp, like soil turned up after rain. The fluorescent tube above me buzzed with a frequency that sat just at the edge of awareness, not loud enough to be consciously irritating, but persistent enough to make the silence feel slightly wrong. A clock on the wall read 9:22. I had roughly 9 hours before the first light would begin to show in the sky behind the trees. I sat down at the desk and read all 12 rules again, carefully. Then I read them a third time. Most of them had a practical logic to them, even if the reasoning wasn't stated. Keeping lights on, not disturbing guests, maintaining a log. These were the kinds of precautions that made institutional sense. But Rule 4 didn't fit the same category. Rule 4 wasn't about liability or guest relations or building maintenance. Rule 4 was about protection, and the specific, almost surgical detail of it, the instruction not just to avoid entering the room, but to avoid even approaching the floor-level threshold, suggested that whoever had written it had thought very carefully about exactly what kind of mistake they were trying to prevent. I opened the red binder. It was thick, easily 300 pages, and filled with handwritten entries spanning what appeared to be several years. The entries were terse, clinical, the kind of writing that strips emotion away and leaves only sequence. 11/4/0217, scratching beneath room 7 floor, approximately 4 minutes, ceased without intervention, logged per protocol. And another, 3/19/045, vibration in hallway outside room 7, duration unknown. Night manager retreated to office, no further action. And another further in, written in a hand that pressed harder than the others, the letters slightly uneven. I heard it breathing. I know what breathing sounds like. This was not that, but it was close enough that my body didn't know the difference. I closed the binder. I placed it back under the desk. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the machine in the corner, and I sat down facing the window that looked out across the parking lot toward the long arm of rooms stretching away into the dark. Room 7 was the fourth door from the left on the north wing. Even from where I sat, I could see that it was set slightly apart from the others. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would be obvious to a guest, but there was a gap of perhaps 2 feet more between room 6 and room 7 than between any of the other rooms, as if even the architecture had learned to keep its distance. The night was quiet. The parking lot was still. The amber light from the sign threw long, pale shapes across the gravel. Then, at exactly 11 minutes past 10, I heard the first sound from the direction of room 7. It was low, it was rhythmic, and it was coming from beneath the floor. I picked up my pen. I opened the red binder. I wrote down the time. I wrote down what I had heard, and I told myself that following the rules would be enough, that whatever was in that room had an arrangement with the rules, and as long as I honored that arrangement, the rules would hold. I believed that for exactly 3 more nights. There is a particular kind of dread that has nothing to do with fear of pain or death. It is subtler than those things, and in many ways more corrosive. It is the dread that comes from being near something that exists outside the boundaries of what you have always understood to be possible. Something that doesn't threaten you with violence, but with revision, the revision of every assumption you've built your understanding of reality upon. That is the dread that Whispering Pines introduced to me, slowly, methodically, over the course of my first week, as though the place itself were calibrating how much I could absorb before it gave me the full weight of what it contained. By my 3rd night, I had developed a working familiarity with the motel's geography, which is to say, I had learned it the way you learn the geography of a place that doesn't want to be understood. The 12 rooms of the north and west wings were mostly occupied by what I came to think of as permanent residents, people who paid weekly, who ordered food delivered to the lot rather than leaving for it, who occasionally appeared at the office window late at night to request an extra blanket or towel, but who never made eye contact and never lingered. There was a man in room 3 who worked nights and whose room I never saw the inside of, though I knew he was there because his truck was gone from 10 until 6 every morning with mechanical regularity. There was a woman in room 10 who had 2 cats whose existence was technically against the rules listed in the guest agreement, but whose presence I had decided was not my problem. There was a couple in room 12 who argued in a language I didn't recognize, quietly, persistently, in a cadence that wasn't quite arguing and wasn't quite conversation, and whose voices stopped every night at exactly midnight, as though a switch had been thrown. These were the human textures of the place, strange in their own right, but human, comprehensible. Room 7 was something else entirely. The physical facts first, because the physical facts matter. Room 7 sat at the far interior corner of the north wing, where the building's L shape turned. This position meant it shared walls with room 6 on one side and with the maintenance corridor on the other, a narrow, doorless passage that ran along the back of the building and was accessible only from an exterior utility door that required a key I had been given, but told explicitly never to use unless there was a structural emergency. I had looked down that corridor on my 2nd night, standing at the exterior door with my flashlight. No more than a sweeping look, just enough to orient myself. And what I had noticed was that the section of the corridor running behind room 7 was darker than the rest, Not dark the way unlit spaces are dark, where a flashlight beam fills and illuminates. Dark the way a space is dark when something inside it is absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. I turned off my flashlight and went back inside, and I did not open that door again. The layout of Room 7's door was identical to all the others. Burgundy painted wood, a brass knob that had gone green at the edges, a small peephole at eye level. But unlike every other door in the building, Room 7 had something wedged along its base, a thick rubber seal, the kind used in industrial cold storage, had been applied to the threshold gap with what looked like construction adhesive, pressing it flat against the floor and the door's bottom edge so tightly that not even air should have been able to pass through. It was a modification that predated my employment by years. The adhesive had yellowed and the rubber had compressed into permanence. Someone had sealed that gap with tremendous care and deliberate urgency, and they had done it not to keep things out. They had done it to keep something in. The sounds began every night at the same time, 11:45, give or take a few minutes, and they followed a consistent pattern that I came to map with unsettling precision. First, a vibration, not a sound you could hear so much as a pressure you could feel in the soles of your feet and the base of your spine, a low subsonic tremor that traveled through the building's concrete foundation and announced itself as a wrongness in your body before your ears could name it. Then, after several minutes of this vibration, the scratching began, slow at first, rhythmic as I'd noted on that first night, deliberate in a way that animal movement is never deliberate, in a way that suggested intention rather than instinct, as though whatever was making the sound had thought carefully about tempo. On my fourth night, I made the mistake of crouching near the front desk to retrieve a dropped pen at approximately 12:30 in the morning, and in doing so brought my ear closer to the floor. What I heard in that position was categorically different from what the sounds had seemed like while sitting upright. From floor level, the scratching resolved into something more structured, not a single rhythmic sound, but layered composition of sounds, multiple distinct rhythms operating simultaneously, interlocking, as though several things were working in coordinated effort. And beneath all of it, so low I felt it in my jaw more than I heard it with my ears, there was something that was almost a voice, not language, not anything I could assign human origin to, but patterned, intentional, aware. I stood up very quickly. My hands were shaking. I wrote in the red binder, 12:31. Subsonic vocalization detected from beneath north wing floor near Room 7 corridor. Multiple rhythms, not mechanical, not animal. I read back through the binder that night with a thoroughness I had not applied to it before. The entries were not evenly distributed across all the room numbers, the way you would expect if the unusual occurrences were random or general. They clustered around Room 7 with a density that made the pattern impossible to ignore once you saw it. Entries from 3 years ago described vibrations of increasing intensity toward the end of each month. Entries from 2 years ago described a brief period, 7 consecutive nights, during which the scratching had moved, had traveled. The author of those entries wrote in increasingly fractured language about how the sounds had begun directly beneath Room 7 and over the course of those 7 nights had migrated down the hallway, night by night, growing closer to the front office. And then, on the 8th night, the entries stopped for 11 days. When they resumed, they were written in a different hand, and the first entry simply read, "New management. Previous manager unavailable. Sounds have returned to Room 7. Equilibrium restored." I did not sleep during my break that night. I sat in the orange plastic chair behind the front desk and I read that phrase, equilibrium restored, and I thought about what it meant and what it implied about what had disrupted the equilibrium in the first place and what had been done to restore it, and why the previous manager was described as unavailable rather than simply gone. There was a photograph tacked to the inside of one of the desk drawers. I found it on my 5th night when I was looking for a stapler. It showed the exterior of Whispering Pines in what appeared to be summer, the trees beyond the lot full and green, the parking lot empty and bright in afternoon sun. Standing in front of the office door were 4 people, 3 men and a woman, all in the kind of casual work clothing that suggested they were staff rather than guests. They were looking at the camera. 3 of them were smiling in the way people smile for photographs. The 4th, a young man standing closest to the north wing, was not smiling. He was looking slightly off camera, toward the building, toward the section of it where room 7 sat around the corner. His expression was not fear exactly. It was closer to resignation, the expression of someone who had already processed the fear and come out the other side of it into a bleak and irreversible understanding. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 4 names. I recognized none of them. Below the names was a date from roughly 4 years ago, and below that, a single sentence in the same red ink as Rule 4. 3 transferred, 1 stayed. I put the photograph back in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I stared at the wall for a long time. The next morning, when Doyle came to relieve me at 6, I asked him directly about the photograph. He looked at me for a moment with those pale eyes, and then he said, "The rules aren't suggestions. Nothing more." He turned to the desk and began reviewing the log, and I understood that the conversation was finished. I drove home in the early gray light with the pine trees pressing close on either side of the road, and the wrongness from that building still vibrating in the arches of my feet. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And when I slept, I dreamed of a room with no geometry and a darkness that looked back. I returned the following Thursday for my next shift because the money was real and the fear was something I still believed I could manage. I was wrong on the 2nd count. But I didn't know that yet. The night it happened had been a quiet way that Whispering Pines specialized in, a quiet that was not absence of sound, but rather the strategic arrangement of sounds so that the silence between them felt pressurized. The parking lot held 7 cars. The couple in room 12 had gone silent at midnight on schedule. The man in room 3's truck had left at 10. Somewhere in the north wing, a door had opened and closed without any sound of footsteps accompanying it, which I had logged and decided not to think too hard about. It was 2:17 in the morning when I first noticed the smell. I had been at the desk reviewing a maintenance request left by the guest in room 9, something about a faucet that ran warm even in the cold setting, when it reached me. It arrived without warning and without gradation, the way truly wrong smells do, fully formed and overwhelming, bypassing the instinct that normally prepares the mind for unpleasant input. It was organic, deeply, anciently organic, in the way that soil disturbed after a very long time is organic, full of processes that had been occurring in the dark, accumulating, reaching a saturation point. It was the smell of something wet that had no business being wet, of biological activity in a space that should have contained none. I stood up from the desk. I walked to the office door that faced the north wing and stood there for a moment with my hand on the frame, looking out across the walkway. The exterior lights were on, casting their pale amber across the concrete path that ran the length of the building. The doors were all closed. The curtains in all the windows were still. The parking lot was motionless. But the smell was stronger near the door. I went back for my flashlight. Then I walked out. The rule said not to look under the door of room 7. It did not, in its precise language, forbid walking the perimeter of the building. I told myself this. I understand now what I was doing. I was building a technical justification for moving closer to something I already knew I should be moving away from, because curiosity and the particular human inability to leave a thing unnamed were already in control of my decisions, even as the rational part of my mind maintained the fiction that I was simply performing a responsible inspection. The smell grew incrementally stronger with each step I took toward the north wing. By the time I reached room 5, it had acquired a secondary quality, something underneath the organic rot that I recognized after a moment as copper. Not strong, but unmistakable. The iron salt presence of blood in a quantity too small to see, but too significant for the nose to ignore. I stopped at room 5's door and stood there breathing through my mouth and telling myself to go back. I did not go back. At room 6, I could hear the vibration again, not at the usual hour. It was past 2. The sounds had already done their nightly cycle and ceased. But there it was, returning unexpectedly, the pressure in the soles of my feet and the base of my ribs that announced itself as wrongness. And now I could see, in the beam of my flashlight angled down to the walkway, that the concrete between room 6 and room 7 was wet. Not from rain. The night was dry and cold and had been for days. The wetness was coming from beneath room 7's door. I crouched down before my mind had completed the process of deciding to crouch. The instinct was faster than the intention. And in the light of the flashlight aimed at the base of room 7's door, I could see that the thick rubber seal that had been applied to the threshold gap had separated. Not torn, separated, as if from sustained pressure from the inside, as if something had been working at it from beneath with slow and patient force over a long period of time. And in the half-second between when I registered this and when the reflex to flee should have taken over, a new sound began directly beneath the concrete where my knees made contact with it. A single, deliberate knock from below, timed precisely to the moment when I had gotten close enough to be identified. The building knew I was there. Something in it had noticed me. What I should have done was stand and run. What I did instead, and I have asked myself why 1,000 times since, and I have never arrived at an answer that satisfies me, was lower my flashlight to the gap in the seal and look through. There is no way to describe what I saw in terms that will preserve its accuracy, because what I saw was not designed for the human visual system, and the human visual system had to improvise a vocabulary for it in real time. I will tell you the components as my brain received them. Space that did not obey the dimensions of the room it was contained in, a depth that could not have been there given the building's footprint, not the depth of a large room, but the depth of something vast, something without a far wall. Movement that was not movement as bodies move, but movement as patterns shift, the sensation of witnessing reorganization rather than locomotion, and light where there should have been only dark, but light of a color that I cannot name because it does not exist in any spectrum I had ever been asked to perceive before. And the eyes. Not one pair, not two, a number that my mind refused to count, because counting them would have required holding the full image in focus for longer than my brain was willing to sustain it. They were arranged not in any configuration that made structural sense, not the bilateral symmetry of an animal's face, but scattered, distributed, like illuminated points in a field, all of them oriented in the same direction, all of them looking at me. The moment of contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then I was standing. Then I was moving. My body had made the decision before my mind could deliberate, and I was grateful for this, because I do not believe my mind would have been capable of making decisions in that moment. My flashlight hit the concrete when I stood, and I left it there. I did not stop moving until I was inside the office with the door closed behind me. The scratching started 11 seconds later, but it did not come from behind room 7's door. It came from the floor directly beneath my feet. Let me be precise about what I understood in those first seconds inside the office, because precision is the only honesty I have left to offer. I understood that Rule 4 was not a restriction. It was a containment protocol, and it had assumed a variable it could not control. It had assumed that the night staff would follow it. It had not accounted for a night when they didn't, because the people who wrote it had perhaps believed that the horror of the sounds, the smell, the binder full of evidence would be enough to sustain obedience indefinitely. They had not factored in the specific catastrophic combination of exhaustion, olfactory provocation, and the irreducible human compulsion to see what must not be seen. I had broken the arrangement, and the thing in room 7 now knew my precise location. The scratching beneath the floorboards was not like the scratching I had heard before. The previous sounds, the rhythmic subsonic cycling that started at 11:45 and ran its course and ceased, had the quality of routine about them. They felt like biological maintenance, like something moving through its natural patterns the way a sleeper moves and adjusts and settles throughout the night. These scratches were different. These were responsive. They followed my movements. When I walked to the far side of the desk, the scratching traveled beneath the floorboards to stay directly under my feet. When I stopped, they stopped a half-second later, the delay suggesting not failure to track me, but the deliberate performance of cessation, the same way a predator will go still when the prey goes still, not from confusion, but from strategy. I picked up the phone on the desk. I called the number Doyle had given me for emergencies, written on a card taped to the desk's surface in his careful, pressured handwriting. It rang 8 times. Then it clicked to a voicemail that had not been set up, and a mechanical voice told me to try again. I called again. 8 rings. The mechanical voice. I called a 3rd time, and this time it did not ring at all. It connected to silence. A live silence. The kind of silence on a line where someone has picked up and is present but not speaking. "Doyle," I said, "something happened. I looked under the door. I need you to tell me what to do." The silence continued for a moment. Then from within it, distant and filtered through something that muffled its exact character, came a sound I recognized. The scratching. The same frequency, the same deliberate rhythm, coming through the phone line, which meant it was audible at whatever location Doyle's phone was, which meant it had already traveled farther than room 7. Then the line went dead. I looked down at my feet. The scratching beneath the floorboards had stopped, not subsided, stopped with the sudden totality of a machine switched off. The silence that followed it was not the pressurized silence of the motel's usual nights. It was a listening silence. and the distinction between those two things is something the human body knows instinctively, even when the mind cannot articulate it. I was aware, in a way that bypassed all cognition and went straight to the nervous system, that I was being assessed, that whatever had followed me through the floorboards was now determining something. Then, from the window at the front of the office, the large window looking out across the parking lot toward the north wing, I saw the door of room 7 open. Not quickly, not violently, the way a door opens when someone on the other side has turned the knob with ordinary human patience and pushed with ordinary human force. The burgundy door swung inward, and the darkness beyond it was not the interior darkness of an unlit motel room. It was the darkness I had seen through the gap in the seal, dimensional, deep, containing movement that was not locomotion. The amber light from the parking lot's fixtures did not penetrate it. It stopped at the threshold as though encountering a surface. Nothing came out. The door simply stood open, and I stood at the office window and stared at the open door and at the darkness it framed, and I was aware of a pressure building behind my eyes that was not a headache and was not emotion, but was something my neurology had no existing category for. The sensation of being perceived by something that perceived in a manner entirely unlike sight. I discovered something in that moment that I believe the previous managers had also discovered, which is that the worst part of the horror at Whispering Pines was not the threat of physical harm. The entity in room 7 did not lunge, it did not pursue, it did not produce tentacles or teeth or any of the gothic architectures of monsterhood that the human imagination prepares you for when it rehearses fear. What it did was look, and the looking was the damage. Because what it saw when it looked, I understood this without anyone telling me, understood it the way you understand things that arrive as complete knowledge rather than learned information, was all of you. Not your body, not your thoughts exactly, but the full architecture of your understanding of what is real. And simply by looking at it, it revised it, permanently, without your consent. I cannot explain to you what I mean by this in terms that will make rational sense, because rational sense is one of the things that was revised. What I can tell you is that when I looked back at that open doorway, the parking lot behind me reflected in the office window looked slightly wrong in a way I could not name. The trees at the far edge of the property were arranged in a pattern I did not remember from any previous night, and more importantly, I was not certain whether they had changed or whether what had changed was my ability to perceive their arrangement correctly. My sense of the building's geometry, which room was adjacent to which direction was north, had developed a wobble in it, an uncertainty, like a compass being held near a strong magnet. I grabbed my bag and my keys from the desk. I moved to the office's rear door, a secondary exit I had identified on my first night out of pure professional habit, and I opened it and I left. I did not look back at room 7's open door. I have given myself significant credit for this small discipline because everything in the strange new weight of my nervous system wanted to look. Looking had become a compulsion the moment the contact was made, and I understood with terrible clarity how the previous night managers had ended up where they ended up. Not because the entity had done anything to them in a conventional sense, but because once the looking began, the refusal to keep looking required a force of will that the human mind was not designed to sustain indefinitely. I got in my car, I drove down the two-lane highway with the pine trees pressing close on both sides, and I did not stop driving until the trees ended and the first gas station appeared in the distance, and its ordinary fluorescent lights hit my face like something physical, like proof. My hands stopped shaking somewhere around the 40-minute mark, but the wobble in my sense of geometry did not stop. It has not stopped since. I did not go back to Whispering Pines. I want to be clear that this decision was not made from courage or clarity, but from a kind of biological shutdown, a physical refusal that originated somewhere below conscious reasoning and would not be argued with. My body had decided for me, and for once, I was grateful to be overruled. What I did instead was research, because the part of me that had been revised by the contact was not the part that needed to understand things. If anything, that part had been amplified, sharpened into something compulsive and sleepless. I needed to know what the place was and what it had been, and how long it had been what it was. The property records for Whispering Pines were accessible through the county assessor's office, and they were, on their surface, entirely ordinary. The motel had been constructed in the late 1960s by a developer whose name appears in several other properties in the region without distinction. It had changed hands 6 times in the intervening decades. The current ownership was registered to a holding company whose principals were a list of names I could find no other public record of. Not corporate filings, not property associations, not social media or professional registries. They existed on paper and nowhere else, which is a thing that happens legally, but which in context felt like something else. The local historical archive had 3 references to the property. The first was a brief notice from a county newspaper in the mid-1970s reporting that construction work being done on the building's north wing had been halted after workers encountered what the article described only as an unexpected subsurface irregularity requiring specialized assessment. The work resumed 3 weeks later without further explanation. The second reference was a brief item from the 1980s noting that a night shift employee at the motel had been hospitalized following what was described as an acute psychological episode of undetermined origin. The employee was named in the article, but the name matched nothing in any subsequent record I could find, as though the person had existed up to that point and then concluded. The third reference was not a news item, but a letter to the editor, published in the same county paper in the early 1990s, from a man who identified himself as a former employee of the motel. The letter was brief and had apparently been printed without the editor having understood its significance. The man wrote that he wanted people in the area to know that the motel on the highway employed a set of operational rules that were not for the benefit of the guests, and that the management was not what it appeared to be, and that anyone offered a position there should decline regardless of the compensation. The letter concluded with a single sentence: "The room at the corner of the north wing has never been empty." The editor's response, printed directly below the letter, read, "The views of this contributor do not reflect the editorial position of this publication. We wish him well." I called Doyle one more time, 3 days after my last shift. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly as it had been the first time I spoke to him. Flat, unhurried, the voice of someone who had processed everything. I told him I was not returning. He said he knew. I asked him how many people had held my position before me in the past 5 years. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Enough." I asked him what had happened to the ones who hadn't left. He said, "They found an accommodation." I asked him what that meant. He said, "Different things for different people." Then he said, very precisely, the way he said everything, "You looked and you left. That puts you in a very particular category, a fortunate one. I would recommend not testing the limits of that fortune." I asked him what he was, what Doyle himself was in relation to the thing in room 7. "Management," he said, and hung up. I have thought about that word every day since. Management. As a description of a relationship with something like what lived in that room, the word implied a long-standing arrangement, one with negotiated terms, one in which both parties had agreed to a set of behaviors and a set of limits. It implied that the thing in room 7 did not act randomly or with indiscriminate hunger. It implied that it wanted something specific, and that Doyle and the ownership behind the holding company, and possibly the ownership before them for decades, had been providing that something in exchange for the containment that the 12 rules represented. I have a theory about what that something is, but I'm not going to share it here. Not because I want to be mysterious, but because the theory once stated has a quality similar to looking through the gap under the door. It transfers something into the listener that the listener cannot give back. I have already tested this. I told the theory to one person, a friend who had listened with patience and skepticism to everything else I told them about Whispering Pines. After I shared the theory, they were quiet for a long time. Then they said the geometry of the room felt slightly wrong. They have said this on every occasion we have spoken since. I will not share the theory. What I will tell you is what changed in me, because this is what I think the account is actually for, not to satisfy curiosity, but to serve as a kind of record, the same function as the red binder under the desk, the function of documentation, of saying, this happened and this is what it cost. The geometric wobble I described, the unreliability of my spatial perception, the compass near the magnet, has not resolved. It is most pronounced in enclosed spaces at night, and it is worst in the hours between 11:45 and 4 in the morning, which I do not think is coincidental. During those hours, the walls of whatever room I am in feel negotiable in a way that stable walls should not. Corners are uncertain. The floor is mostly trustworthy, but not entirely. I have learned to navigate this the way you learn to navigate any chronic condition, with compensatory strategies, with acceptance, with the understanding that the baseline has shifted permanently, and the task now is to function within the new baseline, rather than to recover the old one. I also hear it sometimes, the scratching, not from beneath my current floor. I have moved 3 times since leaving Whispering Pines, and the sound does not follow me with any physical consistency, but in the register of sound that exists at the boundary between hearing and feeling, in the subsonic range that the body receives before the ears can, I sometimes detect a rhythm that I recognize, most often when I am in the shallow half-sleep that precedes full unconsciousness, when the mind's editorial function is tired enough to let things through unfiltered. The rhythm is slow and deliberate and layered, the same interlocking complexity I heard when my ear was close to the floor of the office, and in those moments I understand, without any logic to support it, that the recognition is mutual. I looked, and it saw me looking, and the seeing went both ways permanently, like a channel opened between 2 points that cannot be closed, because the opening was the damage. The new night manager at Whispering Pines, I know there is one because the motel's listing on the Regional Employment Board went back up 6 days after I left, does not know any of this. They walked into the office on their first night, and Doyle handed them the laminated list, and they read Rule 4 in red ink, and perhaps they thought, as I thought, that it was simply the strangest of a set of strange institutional precautions. Perhaps they are still following it. Perhaps they are, right now, sitting at the desk under the buzzing fluorescent light, listening to the scratching begin at 11:45 and writing it down in the binder and telling themselves that the rules will hold. I hope the rules hold. I genuinely hope they hold. But I know something now that I did not know when I took that job, which is that rules like Rule 4 are not written to be unbreakable. They are written in red because red is the color that gets the most attention, the most urgency, the most resistance. And they are written at all because someone, at some point, had to discover what happened without them. Someone had to crouch at the threshold in the dark and look through the gap and meet the distributed eyes in the wrong darkness of that impossible room, and survive the looking long enough to communicate the rule to whoever came next. Someone had to be the first. And somewhere along the line in the long chain of night managers at Whispering Pines, going back further than the county records reveal, there must have been a night when there was no rule, when the door of room 7 existed without prohibition, when a night shift employee, motivated by the same copper smell and the same seeping dark liquid and the same irresistible architecture of human curiosity, approached the door without any warning, without any red ink, without any accommodation between the management and the thing being managed. I think about that person sometimes. I think about what they saw and what they felt, and whether they survived the looking, and what kind of deal was offered to them on the other side of it, and what they agreed to in order to walk back out of that hallway and into the amber-lit parking lot and down the highway between the dark trees toward whatever remained of their ordinary life. I think about what they told the next person, and the person after that, and how over time, through iterations of human fear and institutional calculus, and whatever arrangement Doyle and his predecessors had refined, the encounter had been compressed into a single sentence in red ink on a laminated card behind a motel front desk in the middle of nowhere. Do not look under the door of room 7. Whoever you are, reading this or hearing this or finding this in whatever form it reaches you, I am adding my name to the long chain of people who looked and lived and felt the obligation to pass the warning forward. Do not take the job. Do not let the pay persuade you. Do not tell yourself that you are different, that you are more disciplined, that your curiosity is something you can manage because you have always managed it before. Some rules are written in red because the cost of breaking them cannot be repaid, because the thing on the other side of the door is patient in a way that has nothing to do with time as you understand it. It has been there longer than the building around it, longer than the highway that leads to it, longer than the language we use to describe things that wait in the dark. It was there before the rule. It will be there after the rule. The rule exists only for you. And if you find yourself on your knees in the small hours of the morning, with the cold concrete under your palms and the smell of copper in the air and the thin gap of the threshold an inch from your eye, and you feel the absolute certainty that there is something extraordinary just beyond it, something that has never been seen, something you could be the first to truly understand, put your hands on the floor, stand up, walk away. Because the thing in room 7 has seen you already. It has been watching you from the moment you turned down this road, and the only thing between you and the full weight of what that means is a rule written in red, and your willingness, against every instinct you possess, to obey it. Walk away. The scratching can wait. It has always been good at waiting.